Welcome to Ask and Learn.
So we know the graph is going to look something like this because it's a rational function. But first, let's find out the asymptotes so that we can know exactly where the graph is going to be. First of all, the domain. Since there's a square root on the bottom, we cannot, since there's a square root, we cannot have a negative under the radical. And also, we cannot have the denominator to equal 0. So that means for the domain, it can be anything besides x is 0. So x cannot equal 0 for the domain, and x cannot equal plus or minus 1. But it can exist anywhere else. Intercepts, there are none. So substituting 0 for x or y, we see that there are no intercepts. Symmetry, it's odd because f of negative x is equal to negative f of x. So it has an odd symmetry. Asymptotes, so first let's find the vertical asymptotes. So where the denominator equals 0, we already said that was plus or minus 1. So let's test out the limit as x approaches plus or minus 1. So let's do 1 first. And if this equals infinity or negative infinity, we know it's a vertical asymptote. So substituting 1, we see it's 1 over 0, so that's infinity. And if we do the same thing for negative 1, we just know it's going to be negative infinity. So for vertical asymptote, we can say that x is plus or minus 1. That's where our asymptotes are, which is why the domain cannot be plus or minus 1. All right, and now for horizontal asymptote, the horizontal asymptote is where the limit approaches infinity or negative infinity. So the limit as x approaches infinity of our function x over square root of x squared minus 1. So if we factor out in the denominator, we get the limit as x approaches infinity of x over the square root of x squared 1 minus 1 over x squared. And if we take that out of the square root, if we take this out of the square root, we get an x, and x cancel. So we're left with the limit as x approaches infinity of 1 over the square root of 1 minus 1 over x squared. 1 over infinity is 0, so 1 minus 0 is 1. So our limit is 1. And the limit as x approaches infinity, or a negative infinity, we're going to follow very similar steps. The only difference is that when we pull out, because it's approaching negative infinity here, when we pull out the x squared out of the radical, we're just going to make it negative x. So we're going to be left with, when they cancel out, a negative on the bottom. That's the only difference. So the limit of negative square root of 1 minus 1 over x squared is negative 1. So we have a horizontal asymptote at y equals 1 and y equals negative 1. And now we can graph with the information that we have. All right, so I'm going to put in the asymptotes in red. So here we know, actually I put them in green. So here we know x plus or minus 1, 1, minus 1. That's our vertical asymptotes. And we also know that y is 1. When y is 1 and negative 1, we have a horizontal asymptote. And that's where our function can lie. That's how you graph that.